We hear all the time about checks and balances, right?
Yeah.
In our government, I mean. It's like it's the foundation of American democracy. But how many of us actually know, like, what makes it work?
It's definitely one of those things that sounds simple at first, but when you get into it, it's surprisingly complex.
Totally. And today we're going really deep on one of the most important pieces of that whole puzzle, judicial review. We're talking about the power of the courts, right? To look at laws, even stuff the government does, and just say, wait, this isn't how it works. This isn't, like, constitutional.
Yeah. And the thing is, this power wasn't just like given to them. It wasn't just handed over. It came about through a bunch of really important Supreme Court cases, starting back in the early 1800s. Marbury v. Madison, Martin v. Hunter's lessee, and Cohen's v. Virginia.
So, like, powdered wigs and quill pens.
Right.
Not exactly Law and Order, but the drama is definitely there. These cases are how we interpret laws even today, and how power is balanced in the U.S. It all goes back to these cases.
Totally foundational. They weren't just about some specific argument. They were about defining the whole structure of American power.
Okay, so first up, Marbury v. Madison. This one starts with, well, a power struggle between President Jefferson and the guy before him, John Adams. Imagine, right? A brand new country, tensions are super high. That's where all this starts.
And Adams, on his way out, decides to appoint a whole bunch of judges, like at the very last minute, the famous midnight judges. It was a way to, well, keep the Federalists in charge, even though Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican, was taking over.
And that's where we meet William Marbury. He was going to be one of those midnight judges, a justice of the peace, but his commission, the paper that makes it official, never made it to him. Talk about bad timing.
Oh, yeah. Marbury got caught right in the middle of this whole political battle, and he decided to take his case right to the top, to the Supreme Court. He wanted them to force the delivery of his commission.
That's bold. But then we have Chief Justice John Marshall in charge of the case. That's going to be a tough spot, no.
A total tightrope walk. If he sided with Marbury, he was basically challenging the new president, Jefferson. Could have been a huge crisis. But if he sided with Jefferson, well, that could make the whole court look weak and set a really bad example for the future.
So what did he do? Sounds like a lose-lose situation.
Marshall's solution was, honestly, kind of brilliant. He said, okay, Marbury, you're right, you deserve that commission. But then he said the part of the law that let Marbury go straight to the Supreme Court was unconstitutional.
Wow. So he basically dodged the whole fight, right?
Yeah.
But in doing that, he gave the Supreme Court way more power.
You got it. By saying that part of the law was no good, Marshall created this idea of judicial review. It wasn't like a flashy power grab, but it changed how power works in the U.S. From then on, the court could be a check on the president and Congress.
So Marbury v. Madison, this one case, changed how we interpret laws and how power works in America. But it didn't stop there, right? Judicial review was just getting started.
Oh, it was just the beginning. Marbury showed the court could review federal laws, but what about laws from individual states? That's where our next case comes in.
Okay, so things are about to get even more interesting. Let's get into it. Okay, so we've got Marbury v. Madison showing the Supreme Court can review federal laws. But you were saying there's more. What happens when state laws are involved?
Well, that's when it gets really interesting. I mean, think about it. The U.S., right? It's all about federalism. You've got the big federal government and then all the individual states, each with their own WN set of laws. It was and still is a super delicate balance.
Yeah, like a huge legal Venn diagram or something. So how does Martin v. Hunter's lessee fit in?
Martin takes us right to where state and federal power meet, that overlap. You've got a land dispute, someone's inheritance, I think, from Britain, and like treaties and state laws clashing.
Yeah.
And the Virginia courts basically said, Supreme Court, you can't tell U.S. what to do.
The classic state versus federal power struggle. Sounds like this case had it all.
Yeah, and it was a showdown. The Supreme Court, with Justice Story writing this time, they stepped in and said, nope, we can review what state courts do.
Hold on. Why does the Supreme Court get to have the final say on stuff happening in state courts? Wouldn't that cause a bunch of problems?
Well, Story's whole argument went back to the Constitution itself. He said, look, without the Supreme Court reviewing things, you could have states interpreting federal law however they want. It'd be chaos. And that goes against the whole idea of one unified country, right? Plus, he pointed out, sometimes state courts might be biased.
So basically, to make sure everything's fair and consistent, there needs to be one ultimate referee. According to Story, that's the Supreme Court.
Exactly. That idea, federal law being supreme, That's the heart of Martin. It really solidified the court's job, being the ones to interpret the Constitution, even when it all started in a state court.
Okay, so we've seen the Supreme Court review federal laws and now state laws too, at least in civil cases. What about criminal cases, though? Especially when a state itself is part of the case.
Great question. And that brings us to case number 3, Cohens v. Virginia. Happened just a few years after Martin, 1821. Another state versus federal power clash. These two brothers, the Cohens, got convicted in Virginia for selling lottery tickets.
Lottery tickets. Sounds kind of small time for the Supreme Court, no? What's the big deal?
The thing is, Congress had said these lottery tickets were okay. So you've got Virginia saying it's illegal to sell them, while the federal government's saying it's fine.
Ah, okay. Recipe for a constitutional crisis. What happened?
Who else but Chief Justice John Marshall steps up to write the opinion. And he says, once again, the Supreme Court can review what state courts do, even in criminal cases, as long as it involves federal law. He basically said, if a state law goes against the Constitution always wins. End of story.
Marshall's like the superhero of judicial review. He keeps showing up to save the day. He's good at navigating all this legal and political craziness.
Oh, for sure. And with Cohens, he hammered home this idea. The Supreme Court is the protector of the Constitution. Civil case, criminal case, federal law, state law, it doesn't matter. If the Constitution is involved, they have the power to say what's what.
These 3 cases are over 200 years old, and they're still shaping how law works in the U.S. That's kind of amazing.
Totally. They're like the foundation of judicial review here. But there's more to the story, right? We've talked about the idea, but how about how it actually works in real life? How's judicial review been used throughout history? What does it mean for us and now W?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've got this powerful tool, but how's it been used? I'm ready to see some real examples how judicial review changed American history. It's crazy, right, how these cases, Marbury, Martin, Cohens, they were so long ago and they still matter so much.
Yeah, it shows how these early decisions basically made the rules of the game and we're still playing by them.
Right. Like we talked about how judicial review is supposed to work, but I'm thinking about real-life examples now.
Well, Brown v. Board of Education, that's a big one. 1954, textbook example of using judicial review for a huge social issue.
Oh, totally. That desegregated schools, right?
Yep.
Overturned all that separate but equal stuff that had been around forever.
Exactly. The court looked at it and said, nope, segregation is not equal. This goes against the Constitution. Huge for the civil rights movement and everything that came after.
So judicial review could be a tool for good, for making things fairer. But it's not just about striking down laws, is it? What about when the court looks at things the government itself is doing?
Oh, for sure. United States v. Nixon, that's a perfect example. 1974. Nixon was trying to keep those Watergate tapes secret, said it was like executive privilege.
Didn't that case go all the way up to the Supreme Court?
Yep, and they ruled against Nixon. They said even the president has to follow the law. Executive privilege isn't a free pass to do whatever you want, especially not to, like, hide stuff.
Wow. These examples, they really show how much power the Supreme Court has. Their decisions change things in a big way.
No doubt. Judicial review affects everything. Voting rights, the environment, how much money you can give to politicians, even same-sex marriage. It's everywhere.
But, more power means more responsibility or whatever. Doesn't it seem kind of risky to give so much power to just 9 judges? And they're not even elected?
That's a big debate, definitely. Some people say it's too much power, that the court could just force its own opinions on everyone, even if most people disagree.
Yeah, I see that point.
Yeah.
Where's the line between interpreting the Constitution and just making new rules?
Right. And that's where you get into judicial activism versus judicial restraint. It's a whole discussion about how active the court should be.
I gotta be honest, those terms always throw me off. Can you break it down, like what they really mean?
Sure. Judicial restraint, that basically means the court should stay out of things unless it's really obvious a law is against the Constitution. Let the president and Congress do their thing, the people we voted for.
So more hands-off.
Exactly. Respecting democracy and all that.
And judicial activism. That's like the opposite.
Kinda. It's saying the court has a duty to protect people's rights, even if it means going against old laws or decisions. If something's unfair, the court should fix it.
So Brown v. Board, where they basically said segregation is wrong, even though it was legal before, that'd be activism.
Yep, exactly. But it's tricky, right? The line's not always clear. What I see as activism, you might see as just doing what the Constitution says.
It's complicated stuff. Balancing rights and democracy, that's a tough job.
It is. And there's no easy answer. It's a discussion that keeps going with every new case, every new judge on the court.
So we started with those early cases, then saw how judicial review affected huge social movements, even the president himself. What's the takeaway for us, like in our everyday lives?
Think of it this way. Pretty much every law you live under, every right you have, it's been shaped by how the Supreme Court understands the Constitution.
Judicial review isn't just some idea, it's like built into America itself.
Exactly. It's always there, working in the background, affecting law, society, everything. And it's not just history, it's about what happens next, too.
Well, this deep dive has definitely made me think.
We went past the basics, right? We saw where judicial review came from, how its power grew, and how it still matters today.
Fascinating stuff. And it's obvious this conversation's not over yet.
For sure. Every new case, every new ruling, it adds to the story, and we're all part of that story.
I feel like we all learned a lot today.
Yeah.
From Marbury v. Madison all the way to how judicial review affects us every day. It's been a journey.
And this is really just the start. Understanding judicial review, it's an ongoing thing. We got to pay attention, think critically about the courts and what they do, and be informed citizens, right? That's how we participate in this whole thing.
Perfectly said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into judicial review.